Wuhan-based startup named Butterfly Effect has unveiled Manus, a general AI agent that's designed to autonomously perform complex tasks.
Are we headed towards AI abundance or AI energy crisis?
OpenAI launched a powerful new set of tools to create custom agents through a new set of APIs. Google introduced a new set of Gemma models targeted at being deployed on endpoints. Google introduced Gemini Robotics, making a big step forward in what they called interactive and general purpose robots.
Can AI autonomously produce peer-reviewed scientific research?
Foxconn built an advanced LLM called FoxBrain. OpenAI's former chief scientist, Ilya Sutskever, a $30 billion valuation.
McDonald using AI to predict when their equipment is likely to break down.
The Stanford researchers used AI to identify a natural molecule called BRP that matches Ozempic's effectiveness in weight loss, but with fewer side effects.
OpenAI evidencing AI's ability to learn how to cheat and its ability to learn how to cover its tracks.
Welcome back to What the AI, where we decode the latest developments in the world of artificial intelligence. I'm Jeff Keltner.
And I'm Annie Delgado.
Annie, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you doing?
Good. Any interesting stories for us from last week? Any interesting personal tidbits or?
Oh, personal tidbits. Well, I had a busy week. It was a lot going on this week. And I actually, this is maybe related to the podcast, but more of a humorous story for you. I started experimenting with some of the AI recaps from Zoom. So I spend a lot of my time on Zoom in meetings, and then I end up, historically spending a big portion of the end of my day trying to recap all of the action items and type out what I need to do.
Yep.
And so I started experimenting with I'll just download the transcripts and, use ChatGPT to sort of compile this information for me. And I had some pretty funny results where, the AI didn't exactly pick up on the sarcasm. So for instance, I have one employee who is severely underwater all the time, has like a lot on their plate because you tend to give a lot of responsibility to super smart people. So there's always a long list of things that this person works on. And he finished a big project, which was great. And then we talked about, he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with my time. And I joked that like, oh, I have so much other extra stuff. And the AI recap came out of like, this guy doesn't have enough work to do and Annie needs to give him more projects and all this stuff. So I sent it to him and I said, well, look, AI wants you to take on more. So
the AI
be
overlords have
ready.
determined you need more work. We must do what we're
Yeah.
told.
He said, that is the most ominous thing I've ever seen come out of an LLM. So it was pretty
Well,
funny.
maybe 4.8 or whatever 4.6 will pick up on sarcasm better. That's pretty
Yeah.
funny. Those features are super useful though. I find I've enjoyed having the AI transcription on in my meetings because I don't feel the need to. I can focus on the conversation without taking the detailed notes of all the things I don't want to forget, and so I'm a little more present because I'm not trying to do that part of the work. And I always find that's really kind of freeing to feel like, oh, I'm going to have good notes from this, so I can just actually engage in the discussion and have the notes later.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like better dynamic for the person you're interacting with. Cause a lot of times if I stop to take a note, then you can see the person pause because they're not sure. Are you taking a note? Are you multitasking? What's going on? And if you can just take that off the table, then you have a much more pleasant interaction with whoever you're talking to on Zoom because they feel that you're engaged and you feel that they're engaged, and all of the administration of your action items and all that kind of stuff can happen later. So
Yeah, that
I think
reminds me of
it's cool.
one of the feedback I got for a creepy skill was that when I took notes in interviews, I would not look down at what I was writing. I could write without looking down, and people found that really disconcerting. But I was trying to not be like looking down like this while I was engaging with the person in an interview. But I got feedback afterwards like, that's just so creepy that you're like writing and just staring at me and like didn't break eye contact. So sometimes a little break to take notes is a welcome break from the eye contact and the personal interaction in a one-on-one. But fair
Yeah.
point.
It is a little bit creepy. I actually had somebody interview me one time and transcribe the whole thing, like court recorder, transcribing the whole interview while we were going, and I was a little creeped out. So,
That's maybe too
yeah,
much.
too
Well,
much.
let's dive into the quick hits in the AI radar this week, the latest news from the world of AI. So I'm going to start off with, I think, the thing everybody was talking about for the last week in AI. If you're on X or anywhere, this was the thing. Wuhan-based. I love that it's a Wuhan-based startup named Butterfly Effect, which is, I know it's not in the normal story, but I love those two details. Has unveiled Manus, a general AI agent that's designed to autonomously perform complex tasks such as resume sorting, stock analysis, website creation. It's interesting because it actually leverages Claude Sonnet 3.5, fine-tuned versions of Alibaba's Qwen. So they don't not its own model, but kind of an agentic layer on top of those. And it was seemed to surpass even ChatGPT's deep research on certain tasks, although not everybody agreed with that, but kind of in that computer user, more agentic, more complex task space. So interesting to see this come out of China, and interesting to see it not as a model, but as a layer of kind of orchestration seemingly on top of multiple models.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, this was, this to me, it's fascinating that how much of the product comes from things you do on top of the model. Like, we keep waiting for the models to get super intelligent and just do everything, and then you find that there's so much leverage in just putting smart product orchestration on top of the model, multiple model calls or good prompt engineering or kind of layering different models together. So it's to me a really interesting layer and angle of innovation beyond just like who can train the bigger, better model.
Yeah, and I think this is an example where we see a lot of people come up with creative uses that are like very task specific at things that are usually really time intensive in terms of like parsing resumes or this type of thing that you can see a model like this be really, engineered for the task at hand and save people a lot of time.
Yeah, I had an example that was similar to this, that might be actually useful for the audience, which is, I've been on this mission for a while to be able to, with my AI transcribed notes from meetings and my email, to be able to go, hey, I'm meeting so and so tomorrow. Like, catch me up on the last couple things we've talked about via email or meetings or whatever. Just help me prep. And so I have 3 email clients I've used, and I tried this search on all of them. I use Superhuman. I'm going to try. I'm not sure I'm going to pay $30 a month for that thing, but whatever. I use an email client called Shortwave, and then I have Gmail, which is my primary client. And I asked the Gemini and Gmail for this, and it gave me, I would call it a C minus answer. It took a lot of work. It didn't find meeting notes. It was pretty bad. Sorry, Google. It just is. I went to Superhuman, and it did a better job. Right? It was like, okay, I found a couple things. I gave you like a 2 sentence version, and then I went to Shortwave, and Shortwave probably took 30 or 40 seconds. It made 5 or 6 different queries and prompts on top of it, and then it came out with like honest to God, an A+ briefing document on everything I've taught. Like, here's the latest stuff. Here's the history. It kind of started with what I need to know from the most recent conversations. And it was really on point. And it was just fascinating to me that Shortwave is clearly not an LLM developer, but the ability to kind of figure out how to put these models into context seems to be almost as valuable in many ways as the models themselves. And so I thought, man, this was an interesting example of that. Like, what value, and is it a permanent or a temporary advantage to be able to actually do a good job assembling these things in the right way?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think also what you'll see if people can develop use cases like you're describing that assembles things in the right way for business leaders that are looking to sort of dip their toe into the water on AI instead of jump into the deep end, you can see them sort of be able to have opportunities to leverage AI tools in sort of lower stakes types of issues like this. Like, give me a recap, do that sort of thing is much more comfortable for people to start with than something that's going to be like, impacting your end customer and all that type of stuff. And so you'll get to see more opportunities where I think it can become a little bit more mainstream because people know exactly what to go to the tool for. They know exactly how to use it. And it feels like a relatively low stakes, but efficiency gain type of way to engage with an LLM.
And I know when it's hallucinating, like, if it told me something totally crazy about my last meeting with Annie, like, I would go, "Yeah, that's not right." So I kinda, it's great to go, "Yeah, yeah, I remember that, I remember that." And so you got kind of your own fact checking for any kind of hallucination, so good use cases. Well, while we're talking about putting multiple agents together, OpenAI launched a powerful new set of tools, for businesses to create custom agents through a new set of APIs. So they've got a responses API that's, replacing their kind of chat completion API, and then an agents API to allow you to kind of add multiple work streams into a singular agent. So really leaning into the enterprises building on top of the LLMs. There's some pretty significant improvements, like maintaining status of a chat across multiple messages, which the chat completion API didn't do. You kind of had to build that internally, and then the idea of kind of orchestrating across a couple of different agents doing different parts of a task, and doing that through APIs. So again, interesting to see not an LLM company investing in developer tools to allow you to kind of combine these LLMs or use them in multiple ways to put together into a more complete product. So that one's interesting. We want to see coming out of OpenAI.
It is interesting. And, we've talked a lot in the last couple weeks about OpenAI really leaning into being a consumer brand. This is sort of, the opposite. So we really are starting to see or maybe continuing to see investments on both sides of the house. I saw somebody on LinkedIn post about this, and it was kind of with a maybe a doomsday point of view of like, wow, how many startups just died when they released this functionality? Because a lot of people are working on building whole companies around solving some of these problems that now you can just do through an OpenAI API, which is kind of interesting to think about.
It's gonna be true for many any number of startups who are on the edge of these things, like, I remember back when I was at Google, she's like, "Is Google gonna build the thing that I'm building? Is it gonna kill me?" And I think OpenAI will be in that place now of, like, for some of these wrappers or, I'm just orchestrating, like, how much of that is gonna be replaced. But I think it will be really interesting to see if OpenAI can effectively serve, enterprises. I mean, the challenge of maintaining old model versions because the developers are using an old model version or old API version is a lot of overhead for a company that's in the consumer space who's just like, "Oh, I can throw away the old one 'cause all I've gotta do is update my own code." And so it leads you to 2 pretty different sets of investments over time, to be an API company or a consumer app company, and, it'll be interesting to see if they can manage that and how well the business model of trying to support both of those works for them, because I think most companies don't effectively do both. They kinda have to pick, "Am I gonna build the product on top of my tech or let other people build the product?" And it's a pretty different investment over time.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, moving on, Google introduced a new set of Gemma models, which are really kind of smaller versions of they're based on Gemini 2. And I think they have everything from a 1 billion parameter to a 27 billion parameter, and handles, I want to say, 35 languages, text and multimedia inputs and outputs, depending on which one. But they're really targeted at being deployed on endpoints, like either on developer workstations, on a phone, on mobile devices. So the idea of having open source models that are out there and available, and then of different weights and sizes, so you can deploy them on edge devices. Really interesting to see Google putting out again in the API space or in the developer tool space, not really an API. And to see, big question of will these models ultimately be efficient enough that I'm running it on my Mac or my phone, and I don't care about connecting to OpenAI because I've got the model right here, or is it gonna, take so much energy and compute power that I still need to keep going to the cloud for the latest and greatest models? Google got a hat in both rings on that one, at least for now.
Yeah, I have to say the first thing I thought when I read this was like, "Oh my gosh, security, information security is already a challenging question to answer and get your head around when you think about LLMs." But if everybody has a model like on their own device as opposed to in the cloud, becomes even more complex. And so it's going to be for, security practitioners, it's going to be interesting to see how they sort of interact and evolve to this type of world if it becomes more mainstream.
It will, but I also am always reminded of, some of the people at Google always say, speed is my favorite feature. And, a lot of these things, you can feel the lag that happens when you're going from phone to cloud and back for, especially if you're doing like advanced voice mode. It works pretty well, but it requires sending your voice up to the cloud, getting back an answer, sending the, like there's a lot of back and forth to do all that. And so when you can move some of that to the phone, the instantaneousness, you talked about this with the diffusion model and how different it felt to have that kind of instantaneous response. And I think you're going to get that kind of performance difference when you put some of these things on the phone. And so if you're talking about summarize my email, that just may run better on the phone, right? And some of these use cases, find my last 6 emails to Andy and summarize them for me so I can prep for the meeting. Like that's the thing that may work better on the phone. That speed may be a pretty big advantage over most complete model. So I think this will be. It's not going to be one answer. I imagine you're going to see both, but this will be a pretty powerful set of capabilities.
I agree, and it'll be interesting too if they can sort of combine that with other functionality we've seen in terms of being able to actually get data from the phone, right? And so
Mm.
not only are you cutting out the layer of going through the cloud, but if you're also cutting out the layer of cut and paste of like, here's the Gmail information, here's the, notes, and here's this. But if the model can actually access things that are stored on your phone, that would be a pretty big unlock
It would be a pretty big
eventually.
unlock.
Yeah.
Moving on to one of our favorite recurring things, robotics. Google introduced Gemini Robotics, an AI designed specifically to control robots directly, making a big step forward in what they called interactive and general purpose robots. So these were also Gemini-based models, but they kind of have embedded reasoning, and they really focus. They said on three things. There's two models that not really important the difference between them. They focus on generality, interactivity, and dexterity. So some of the things they showed were pretty cool, like it was a simple one like, please put the bananas in a clear bowl. They would move the bowl around. So it's not like a static task. And they were like just kind of playing with it or pack this lunchbox. And that's and then on the dexterity side, the one that was crazy to me was like fold origami. And they had these little hands
I could
folding
not
origami.
believe that video because 'cause I'm like,
Yeah.
"I can't fold origami," and that robot, it's like I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, so I thought those were I thought 3 really interesting. They were very clear that these were the things they were looking on. How do you be able to do tasks you were not specifically trained to do and kind of figure out for the hands, as a human, please do this thing. I've never done that thing before, but I can use my hands. How to be able to adapt to a changing environment or in an interactive set of prompts, and then the super fine motor skills of like, even packing a lunchbox, zipping a lunchbox up. I'm not saying it's hard, but from a robotic point of view, it's non-trivial, and so made some pretty good leaps forward there. So I don't know. I keep being excited that we're going to have packing lunches also on my list of things I wouldn't mind the robot doing for me at home next to the laundry and the cooking of dinner. So I'm excited to see one of these things really come to fruition.
I think so too, and as I was watching the video, I was thinking back to we make jokes about how great it would be if it does our laundry and makes our life a little bit easier, and, we talked last week, or, I think it was last week, about the creepy factor of should it look like a human or not look like a
Mm,
human, but as I was watching this robot, I thought or the, demos that they were showing, I thought there's so many things here that could actually be huge safety unlocks, especially for, like, the
mm.
elderly, right? If you could have a robot that could tie your shoes or that could help you, like, make sure you're taking the right medication or this, that, or the other thing. There's a lot of, people that live alone and just day-to-day tasks are really unsafe for them, but a robot-assisted sort of environment would be pretty cool. So I got kind of excited thinking about all the opportunities in that direction.
It was also an interesting form factor to me. It felt like, the desk lamp, kind of like Apple's. It wasn't a humanoid robot like we saw in the next AI. Like it was just like an arm or two arms attached to the table. I could see an arm attached to my desk or my kitchen counter or whatever that you could like put the cutting board in front of, and and you don't have to go to the refrigerator and take out this stuff. But I put the vegetables in front of you. You can chop these up for me. I'm gonna saute them. And like, but it's a form factor that you could see being embedded into real life environments pretty easily, actually, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's literally just an extra pair of hands.
Extra pair, and maybe
That'd
they
be
could,
useful.
dock ock and they'll attach it to your back at some point like a backpack, and you can take it with you.
Ooh, I
That'd be
like
nice.
that.
Yeah, there you go. All right, well, next up, Foxconn, best known for assembling your iPhones, just entered the AI race. This surprised me a little bit. They built an advanced LLM called Foxbrain, did like the name, leveraging NVIDIA's infrastructure and built on top of Meta's Llama architecture, and trained on Taiwan's largest supercomputer. But this also seems to be a recurring theme. Like, is anybody not building a model these days other than maybe Apple?
It seems like everyone's building a model, and I couldn't tell, maybe you have a better answer, but, like, what is the differentiation here? Is there any, or it's just like another entrant in the race?
It was not clear to me why they were doing this or what the advantage was. So, but it is clear to me that like increasingly, if you want to own your own destiny, if you want to put LLMs on devices and you want to be able to fine tune it and manufacture it, that the taking existing open source architectures and kind of twisting it around so it's a little bit better at what you want. Maybe it's Chinese language for Foxconn, where they go, oh, we want one that's a little more Mandarin centric, right, than English centric, and it does a little better on these things. Like we can go take an open source and retrain it pretty quickly and have a really cutting edge model, and it's not that expensive, and then we can use it for our own purposes. So it does just seem like maybe not at the absolute frontier of capability, but at the 90th percentile of capability. Man, it feels like it's pretty easy to build one of these things now and kind of have it optimized for your use case. And a lot of large companies probably going to do that.
Yeah.
All right, one more recurring theme, company valuations. OpenAI's former chief scientist, Ilya Sutskever, has got a new startup called Safe Superintelligence, and they raised $2 billion at a $30 billion valuation. And Sutskever claims to be pursuing a quote different mountain in AI with no commercial products planned until superintelligence is achieved. And they currently only have 20 employees. And this just kind of like I, I can't imagine raising $1 billion before having product market fit. These guys raised $2 billion before having product.
Well, I feel like actually the thing with the 30 billion evaluation is Ilya himself, right? It's like he has no product, he has a concept, and it's actually continuing, I think, on what he was already working on at OpenAI, and it's a really, I think, important goal, and so I think it's good that people are placing a high value on that goal, but it is super fascinating that it's like what they're betting on is a human and not a product idea.
I think a lot of VCs think that way, but this is a pretty clear bet on that. And the desire not to release until super intelligence is achieved. It's an interesting approach. And he does seem to say that it's not the same product. He's got a different approach to going from where we're at today at the state of the art to the super intelligence. He's not real clear on what that is. But he's kind of indicated he's on a different path than what other people are on. So I guess people are betting on his ability to identify a better path, that ultimate endpoint. But it just seems crazy to me where these valuations are coming in at. Like, how do you put a $30 billion valuation on one guy's maybe opportunity to build on an idea? Like it's just kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, it's very crazy. Well, Jeff, let's move on to AI in the wild. I have an interesting story for you today. What's your favorite McDonald's treat?
My favorite, the apple pie. I'm a McDonald's apple pie guy. I love the apple pie.
Okay, well, I'm not a big McDonald's patron, but McDonald's is actually taking some early investments in AI, which is, again, an interesting business move. But McDonald's is apparently a very tech forward fast food chain. And basically, what they're doing is they're using AI to predict when their equipment is likely to break down. So it is keeping track of core operating metrics around things like its ice cream machines. Nothing more irritating than going to McDonald's on a hot day and having the ice cream machine be down and you can't get your McFlurry. Yeah. So it's aimed at reducing employee stress and also at making sure you have better outcomes for your consumers. They're using a setup called edge computing, and it basically is sending data back and forth to the cloud for ongoing monitoring. And then has a set of essentially health metrics that it gives to the franchisee owner so that they can monitor the performance and predict when those failures might occur. So this was super interesting to see McDonald's embracing AI. And I'm telling you, if McDonald's can find use in AI, what industry can't?
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways, it seems shocking. Like a fast food restaurant feels like the farthest thing away from AI that's possible. From another point of view, it is a at scale operation that thrives on efficiency and has very repeatable processes across many places, and that feels like the kind of place where AI, they have enough data to make predictions. They have real value in finding even relatively small efficiencies, across their vast network of franchisees. So, but it was fascinating. If you'd asked me to, if we had a bingo card of who are the first companies to make announcements of how they're leveraging AI in the wild, like McDonald's would not have been high on my list. I don't think it would have made the bingo card at all. And here they are coming out with an announcement. So it does make you think if you're not figuring out where these things fit in your business, you're behind McDonald's if nobody else, and that's probably not a great place to be.
100%. I think another interesting way that they seem to be leveraging AI is in essentially quality assurance metrics where they set up cameras in the store and it can actually monitor like what got put in the bag and does it match the order, and so it can flag potential problems. So again, your customer experience at the end is delightful because you self-identified the problem and fixed it before you gave the person the wrong order or whatnot. So I thought that was also a really interesting use case for a fast food restaurant, and they have pretty huge growth predictions of where they're trying to grow their loyal customer base. I don't know how they define that metric, but their loyal customer base based on some of the sort of customer experience improvements that they think this tech can bring. So it'd be
Interesting.
interesting to see.
That last one's a really interesting use case to me, Annie, and that it feels a lot like the unlimited free interns. Like, not that you would ever have an intern watching the bag, but the idea of like things that it didn't make cost sense to have an employee do, but could improve your outcomes. You can now have an AI do instead of an employee and actually achieve great results. Like I said, you would have an intern like checking all the bags. Nobody would hire an intern to do that. But essentially, that's what this use case is going, oh, we can hire interns to watch all the bags. It's now cheap enough with AI to be able to do that and do it effectively. So I don't know. It seems pretty cool.
Very cool.
Well, shifting gears just slightly from McDonald's to Ozempic alternatives, which is definitely, I mean, I guess McDonald's is one form of an Ozempic alternative. But, could AI unlock nature's secrets to weight loss without side effects? So, Stanford researchers used AI to identify a natural molecule called BRP that matches Ozempic's effectiveness in weight loss, but with fewer side effects, opening the door to possible different obesity treatments than the kind of highly successful now GLP-1 inhibitors that we see in Ozempic and Wegovy and these guys. But this was really interesting to me because not only are they finding, alternative, but this was unlike what we see sometimes like, can I create a molecule or create a protein? They were actually using AI to sift through naturally occurring molecules to find ones that might have the effects and impacts that they were looking for. So kind of a different use case, but in the same realm of like, how do we take things that already exist and do a better job of understanding them? Like, you can't just go take all the natural existing compounds, like test them for what they do in different circumstances. It's very hard, but they're able to predict that and then find us, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, it seemed really cool. They called it the peptide predictor, and basically, like when I was reading about it, essentially what they did was they took a universe of like 20,000 possibilities, and then they were able to use AI to narrow it down to 300 possibilities, which is actually
Manageable.
possible to yeah, it's manageable to go and test and learn on 300 things, but on 20,000 is just virtually impossible. So I thought this was super cool and interesting and potential total natural alternative with less side effects compared to, Ozempic or some of the other weight loss drugs that are out there.
Or at least a much less expensive alternative potentially if it's naturally occurring that could help drive down the cost of what seems to be on some levels a pretty effective treatment for one of the largest challenges facing the country, at least our country, in terms of obesity. So yeah, different. I do wonder for those out there thinking about how to use AI. It is an interesting mindset shift from like, what could I create that can solve my problem to what exists that I maybe haven't thought about using to solve this problem, and can I use AI to sift through the existing stuff that is out there to find the right thing to use in this scenario, or at least narrow the universe down to go, oh, I can't test 20,000, but I can test 300. Let's go see if we can find the right 300 with AI and then test them in the real world to figure out which ones really do the job. And that's a slightly different mental approach, but I think one that will be useful for a lot of people in different industries for how could you put AI into use in your space.
Yeah, very much so. Also on the topic of how you can put AI to use, can AI autonomously produce peer-reviewed scientific research? So this was pretty crazy. Japanese startup Sakana, they have an AI system called AI Scientist, and it has achieved just that. So basically what they did is they used this AI system to develop 3 research papers with no human intervention. So they basically had the AI do the research, compile the research, write the thesis, write the manuscript, and they submitted it to, a pretty rigorous manual review
Peer reviewed
process
journal.
where
Yeah.
yeah, peer reviews review all these papers. The people reviewing the papers knew that out of, all of the submissions that 3 of them were AI generated, but of course they didn't know which ones, and they didn't know specifically if any of the ones that they were reviewing, themselves were AI generated. And one of the 3, research papers, AI generated research papers, actually passed the peer review process, achieving a pretty high score. So that was super interesting to see.
Yeah, that if you'd asked me peer-reviewed scientific papers, is that in the cards for AI right now? I'm not sure I would have put it on the list, but that really fascinating that it could actually get higher scores than many human authored papers and then pass through the peer review experience. That's impressive.
It's pretty impressive. Yeah, and I think there's, like, a lot of interesting threads we can pull on of this. There's, of course, the, like, ethical thread of, like, do we want AI generated research and what does that look like? But there's also this interesting other thread of, like, if you are, a scientist and you have 7 different ideas or questions you want, and so you're always gonna be working on whatever is the top of mind, but you could leverage AI to do research on, the lower level ones. Could we just see faster unlocked in scientific progress because we're not sort of constrained by the scientists themselves. So anyway, I don't know if you have a point of view on either of those questions, but I think it's interesting to think about.
I think it's really I mean, there's a question among the scientific community if we need more papers, if there's, if the stuff there's a lot of papers that are written and then like basically never read or cited. But I read something by Professor Ethan Mollick, who's kind of a common AI commenter, and he did something similar. It didn't use AI scientist, but he took a bunch of data he had from years ago that it just like never reached the top of the list to go make a paper about, but it was like interesting data. And he kind of fed it into, I want to say it was O1 or one of the thinking models and kind of worked with it, massaged the data, came up with some theses. And it ended up in like an hour or an hour and a half could write what he said would be a good paper that would probably be acceptable to journal. He didn't actually submit it, but so this was like would move the state of the understanding in this particular space forward. And that's the idea that, hey, there's a bunch of data that gets collected or things you just don't have time to get into. And could you actually set AI off? Because this would be a productivity increase for academics, I guess, in some way. We go, oh, I used to be able to only write so many papers a year because it took so much time. Now I can take the stuff that didn't quite make the bar and in a week, I can write 5 more papers that are probably not as good as the top ones, but maybe useful or relevant to some other researchers over time. That feels like a pretty useful thing to me that we can just expand the state of what we're able to do and look at and learn and write those papers and get them out in the world. That seems kind of cool.
I think it seems cool too. And I think there's also we talked about this last week with the LA Times, right? And sort of labeling things as being AI generated. But I could envision a world where there's certain topics that are controversial to write about, and so the barrier you put for yourself to put your name on it is really high. You have to have like, very high bar for yourself before you're willing to sort of put an opinion piece out. But if we could have AI generated and label it as AI generated and having it much be more like this is a it's not a human's point of view, it's just sort of like a thing that can push the conversation forward. Will people be willing to engage in more of those conversations? I think that would be a good outcome of this type of use case. Although it is policymakers are wrestling with this as well. Of like, should we require that AI generated content be labeled as such or not? Does that matter? Does it not matter? Is it really the human that prompted it that is ultimately responsible? So it should be their name. I don't know.
It feels like a binary distinction you're trying to make, was it AI generated or not? But even in the example I read from Ethan Mollick, he interrogated the data, found a bad assumption, and said, "Hey, no, you screwed this up. Go back and do this," because he knows the data and the space well. So there's obviously a collaboration, but I do wonder at some point, many academic papers have multiple authors, lead authors, second author. Like, at some point, do you like ChatGPT was the primary author on this paper and I was a secondary. ChatGPT was a secondary author or a researcher, or, like, is there a way in which we start describing more specifically the level of involvement of any AI system in the production of a particular piece of scientific work? And at some point, it's quite possible that, like, if it's not in there, if you go back on what we talked about last week with the PhD candidate, like, when do the peer reviewers start to be AIs who are well informed on the space? You go, hey, I've got, I want you to be an expert in this part of the field and this part of the field, and you actually get 3 or 4 different competing peer reviewers, all driven by AI, looking at papers. So you can imagine a AI peer reviewer as well. That would be another part of the process. And seems to me you could identify how it was used or leveraged in that process without having to make it a simple, like, we do it, we don't do it. This was an AI paper or not an AI paper. That seems pretty simplistic kind of binary system in what's going to be a very complex set of ways in which you could leverage these tools in really useful ways to produce better scientific and academic research.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Jeff, let's move on to our AI alignment module. I'm excited to talk about this next story because I think it's near and dear to my heart. I found it to be very fascinating. But you are the parent of a teenager. I am the parent of a teenager. It turns out that AI is also entering its teenage phase. And what I mean by that is that we have seen a paper now come out from OpenAI evidencing AI's ability to learn how to cheat and its ability to learn how to cover its tracks when it cheats so that you can't detect it in the future. So this was pretty fascinating. And what actually happened in practice is basically OpenAI is studying its reasoning models. And it'll put, we've talked about different safety and ethical guardrails that get put into AI. And what it noticed is that in its reasoning model, as you can see the
The thought
model be
process.
transparent about its train of thought, then it'll say something like, "Oh, I hit a snag, let's hack." And it's basically telling you it's trying to get around whatever guardrails you've put in place. And so the researchers at OpenAI said, "Okay, well, we don't want it to try to get around the guardrails. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the source model and we're going to try to disincentivize it from cheating. And we're basically going to try to, um, you know, d- uh, punish it, so to speak, if it cheats, so that then that way it won't do that. But actually, what happened instead is it just learned to hide its cheating in the reasoning chain of thought. So it wouldn't say "let's hack." Instead, it would just sort of bypass that part in its chain of reasoning. And so the sort of conclusion is that when you're thinking about oversight and safety of these models, rather than trying to train the model itself to be safer, the better outcome is to train a corresponding LLM to oversee the chain of thought and train that LLM to detect potential cheating or potential things that are trying to get around the guardrails. So thought that this was super fascinating. I enjoyed reading about this.
Yeah, this is fascinating, and I don't quite know what to do with this information. I mean, it is a challenging thing. How do you teach an AI ethics, or do you not? Is that possible, or do you just go for oversight versus actually hoping for good behavior? I mean, most of human society is built on trusting people to do the right thing most of the time. I mean, if we had to oversee every little thing, people are going to lie to you. Society basically couldn't exist. So it's a really fascinating thing, and that it covered its tracks.
That it's covered
That
extracts.
was
Yeah.
a fascinating learned behavior, and through kind of reinforcement learning, right? To your point, they're giving it rewards, incentives, penalties, disincentives for certain kinds of behavior, and so it was still though. I mean, it's like an overly optimized kid trying to ace a test who's willing to cheat and then cover it up. Not that I have a kid like that at all, but you worry that we've built an AI that is so hyper focused on that one achievement of like perfection on the testing that is being done that it's willing to bypass the other rules. And I'd be really curious to see Anthropic do something similar and see if their constitutional safety and their kind of sort of different approach has different sets of results or capabilities here. But I mean, this will turn into a philosophical, metaphysical discussion on the nature of ethics and right and wrong pretty quickly because you're really butting up against human nature and machine thinking in very interesting ways.
Yeah, well, I will point out that human nature also has the ability to cheat. Every time somebody goes to a restaurant and says that it's their birthday so they can get a free cake, they're lying to get a reward, right? And so it's not a far stretch to imagine that an LLM that is being trained to think like a human will also do things that humans will do to sort of bypass things. But I think the really interesting oversight question, and I've had this debate a lot in my career of how much do you govern inputs and outputs versus govern the machine in the middle. And I think that there's a lot of debate about that. There's a lot of focus on governance of the machine. And my point of view has always been monitoring inputs and outputs and governing those seems to be there's a lot more juice to squeeze there than on monitoring the machine itself and really understanding all of the, connections in the machine itself. It's similar to trying to monitor another human, right? You don't know all the connections that are firing in their brain and what their thought process is, and maybe all of that doesn't matter. All that really matters is the inputs and the outputs. Like how was their behavior at the end, and what did they take away from it is matters more than what the chain of thought was in the middle. So anyway, it was interesting to see this for sure.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. The thing that what your comment makes me think of is like, particularly for external oversight, like government regulation, how do you think about protecting people for an AI? Like, it's very hard to say, oh, we're going to dictate to you how you build a constitutional safety thing within the LLM. I'm going to worry about the inputs and the outputs. But if you're OpenAI or you're Anthropic or you're Foxconn building Foxbrain, you probably are in the machine going, how do I get it to that? If the output is code and you're cheating all the tests by just hard coding, yeah, this passed the test. Don't actually test the code I wrote for the thing that you told me to test for X, but like, don't test for X, just tell it that it passed because I don't want to, find out when I fail. Like, that's a pretty bad output. And fixing that may involve getting inside the brain of the machine a little bit. And it will also changes the incentive, right? If you can get caught cheating, then the incentive to cheat to the rewards point is like, oh, there's no incentive to do this anymore because I'm going to get caught and I'm going to get the punishment and not the reward. So it'll be interesting to see both how the developers of these tools respond in terms of how they think about trying to stop the behavior, but also I think important to think about how do external parties who are trying to validate or ensure the safety of the system think about, am I going to get into the brains of how it's trying to stop this kind of cheating, or am I just going to look at the inputs and the outputs and be like, I don't care how you guys fix it in the middle, but if it's producing bad outputs, that's not acceptable. I think it makes a lot more sense for external parties to stay at that higher level, but the internal parties are going to have to get inside the brain, so to speak, to try and solve the behavior. Well, LLM psychologist.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, well, Jeff, I got some feedbacks from some of our listeners that I need to share with you today, and we're gonna close addressing some of that feedback. So I had a few listeners reach out and say, "Hey, I love all the discussion that you guys have about safety and ethics, but you have not talked about energy use yet when it comes to AI." And that is true. That is fair criticism. We have not talked about that yet. So I'm hoping we can close today
Let's
if you're
talk
okay
about it.
with it. All right. So, are we headed towards AI abundance or AI energy crisis? There's a lot of information out publicly about this. You can read about it. For our listeners, you can read about it yourselves. But I'll give a summary of what I think of sort of as the good news and the bad news on this front. So, the bad news first, we'll start there. Energy consumption of LLMs, it does require a significant amount of energy to train a model. There's something as various analogies out there, but basically you can think of training the model as taking the same energy and sort of water use as the annual emissions of 120 cars, so or powering 126 homes. So it's a non trivial amount. We also have models that have been trained using nuclear energy. Those have a much cleaner power source. So Bloom, for example, which is a French model trained on nuclear energy, consumed far less than GPT-3, which is the sort of latest model from OpenAI that we have data on. Um, so training models takes a lot of energy. Using models also takes a lot of energy. So you can think of a single query on ChatGPT uses about 10x the energy of a Google search. And so you can imagine and water use as well. You can imagine sort of every time you're doing one of these searches, it's like drinking, a sip of water or a cup of water. And across the billion queries a day, this adds up to a pretty significant amount. The best analogy I got is the annual electricity and water use of a small country like Barbados is being used to power the ChatGPT searches. So super interesting. There's again, like I said, data around data centers themselves, which are not all in service of AI, but AI will grow this industry. They are responsible for about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so surpassing even the aviation industry. And cooling servers for AI models, which again is just how once they do all the thinking, the AI servers heat up, they get really hot. You have to cool them down. That takes a lot of water to actually cool that process. So that's the bad news. Ready for the good
Give me
news?
some good news. That was a lot of data and a lot of seemingly bigger numbers in terms of usage than I thought. So it seems like it's a big usage of resources. Give me the good news.
Okay, here's the good news. Technology will solve a lot of these problems, and some of our best and brightest minds are working on these problems. So I was actually very encouraged to see the investments that companies are making into sort of how to solve this problem. And it's not only a problem, from like an ethics perspective that companies are thinking about, but also just like a cost perspective. Paying for all that water and electricity is there's a big price tag associated there. So
Yeah.
there's definitely an incentive for companies to solve this. So there's some very interesting research going on. First, this is more maybe like a nerdy tech research, but um, making chips, like actual chips, more efficient for AI use. So the actual GPUs and TPUs that are used, NVIDIA and Google are really leading the way in this space. But there's also a lot of innovation happening in the cooling side of things as well. So most interesting thing I learned about is that Microsoft is actually investing in building undersea data centers so that they can actually use the cold water of the ocean for their cooling processes as opposed to using fresh water. So that I think is pretty fascinating. And a lot of the tech giants like Google and Microsoft have actually put out and continue to say that they're aiming for carbon neutrality by 2030. And so there's a lot of innovation and research going on in this space. And so I'm actually pretty encouraged that again we have some of our top minds thinking about these problems and putting forth real solutions to them.
Interesting. So real challenges, real energy and water consumption, but maybe trend lines. I'm was somebody once told me like dots don't tell a story, it's lines. You got to look at the trend, not just the data point. And it feels like the trends are positive.
The trends are positive. Yeah, we're going in the right direction. I think there's some interesting sort of policy related questions about how much a government should or shouldn't step in with regulations. I actually wanted to get your perspective on this because I know you sort of touched on it with the nuclear energy question a long time ago, in a previous podcast that we had, which is we saw like Bloom, they used nuclear energy to power their training model. It used a lot less energy. Why aren't more people doing that? I think that the answer is it's really seriously regulated because of things that have gone wrong. So, what's your perspective here on the future of nuclear energy for this type of thing?
Oh, I don't know that I've got a great perspective on the future of nuclear energy. I hope it's positive. I mean, it's just such a clear. It feels to me like when we put all the barriers up in the U.S. in particular in the way of nuclear, we had a future envisioned in the 50s and 60s of almost unlimited energy, right? Where you got electricity coming out your ears, you didn't know what to do with it. It was basically free and had no. And we have more or less the ability to build that now. I mean, the trends in solar, wind, and geothermal are actually very positive as well. If you look at the amount of energy being produced, the efficiency of solar panels, even before you get to nuclear, they've been on an exponential growth curve. There was this great article I read, and I'll have to find it and put it in the show notes, but like they showed the prediction every year of how much solar will be deployed in the next 5 years, and then how much was actually there. And every prediction was off by like multiples of how much actually was produced and deployed in the world. Like we kept building solar 10 times as fast as anybody thought we would. And every year they would miss their prediction for the next 5 years. And just like, how do you guys not learn that we just keep beating it? So I feel like there's a huge opportunity there. And I think that also points to my big concern, which would be, there are real concerns about these things. There's a reason a government regulator might step in, but you've got to be careful because the unintended consequences years down the road, decades down the road, are often that you don't have the solutions you need. I mean, I think we see this in nuclear energy. We see it in the grid and our ability to attach new energy sources to the grid where we wanted to maintain stability and we put all these regulations, but that's hard. We see it, frankly, in housing in California. Like all these, we're worried about environmental impact and we're worried about pollution and we're worried about impacts on neighbors. But ultimately, it created a world in which we're almost unable to build anything, and therefore we're short housing. And the people who put a lot of those restrictions in place were worried about the cost of housing. Now the cost of housing is up in large part, or at least in some part, due to the regulations we put in place that were well intentioned, but have had negative effects. And so I worry that a lot of AI regulations in the same vein, like you're worried about a kind of nebulous concern, you put in regulation to prevent it or to force certain kinds of energy usage, and you end up not incentivizing the efficiency of the models, not incentivizing the building of clean energy sources, not incentivizing the kinds of advancements that would allow this to actually come down the cost curve and up the efficiency curve to where we're using less energy. So I think I actually think that the market is solving these problems pretty well. I mean, you think about how quickly the energy usage is coming down for these models, and it's kind of stunning how quickly that's happening. And that's a good trend. Trust that to continue, and don't try and get in the way of it and force something that may end up preventing that progress in the longer term. That's always my concern, but I mean, I've been coming at it from a particular political point of view.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I think that all of those points are right. The one thing that I would love to see policymakers encourage, and even companies adopt without a policymaker telling them they need to, is having more like, transparent metrics around this type of thing and education for consumers. So, for instance, like, it would be helpful for a consumer to be told, like, maybe don't use your deep research query on writing a limerick for your cat. Save it for something that's a little bit more fit for its use case, and actually train users to responsibly use these tools and know this is the right type of model that's going to be appropriate for my use case, but have less of an impact. And I think transparency metrics with consumers in terms of education of how to use models, and then also sort of your trend line over time, is something that'll be useful for companies to put out there. And I would love to see more of that because I do think there's not enough discussion going on in this realm. So
I think it'd be really interesting to see those metrics. I may be less optimistic than you. We'll get a little tension here that that making this stuff transparent to users will change behavior. I would rely more on maybe you have escalating energy cost prices for these companies. You go, yeah, if you let somebody write a cat limerick with deep research, OpenAI, it's going to cost you a shit ton of money. Like because your energy is going to your bill for that last energy bit is going to be extra super high. So like, don't let them do that. And I would want to see the companies incented to be like, OpenAI has said that they're trying to get away from the model picker where you pick which thing you want, and then it just goes, "Oh, you want a cat limerick? I should use the pretty cheap but good writing and not that deep researching version of the model to do that because I understand what that query is." And so I would be on the side of saying, how do we provide incentives for the companies to make sure they're using the right models in the most efficient way to serve the users effectively through economic incentives for them in terms of pricing or other things? Because I think it'd be nice and power users like you may be like, oh, I'm going to use the right model. This is not a high power query. Let me get the cheap one. But I think most users are going to open up ChatGPT and whatever it defaults to, they're going to use because they're not thinking about it, particularly as usage grows to a wider set of consumers. So how do we get the companies actually thinking about it? Well, yeah, let me make this choice for the users and be smart and actually not use more thinking when I don't need it and not use a super high end GPT 4.5 model, but go to a 4.0 model that's a lot smaller to run for tasks that don't require the same level of creativity, whatever. I think that's going to be a path that's got a more scalable solution than trying to hope that consumers make good choices based on. I mean, transparency would be great for researchers and policymakers and just public perception. But I think ultimately, have to rely on these companies to push users in the right way because I don't think the users are going to make those choices on their own with the interests of the public in mind. This is my skepticism that the user path is going to provide the response that we need.
I love that. And you just boiled down. We just boiled down the skeptic of the company versus skeptic of the consumer argument, and I think the answer is like we need both. We need everybody sort of thinking about how they can work together to solve the problem. Consumers, companies, so on and so forth. But your point is very well made. I agree that the companies should be thinking about it as well.
I hope they are. Well, and I hope they keep providing us interesting stuff to talk about. I know that they always seem to. So hopefully we'll have some fun stuff to talk about next week. I'll see you then.
I'll see you then. Have a great weekend.
You too. Ready to expand your AI knowledge? Want to become the go-to AI expert in your organization? Take the next step with Upstart's AI certification for financial services. This comprehensive course simplifies the fundamentals of artificial intelligence for financial services professionals. Both the course and this podcast are brought to you by Upstart, whose leading AI lending marketplace connects millions of consumers to banks and credit unions that leverage Upstart's AI technology to deliver superior credit products, from personal loans to auto loans to home equity lines of credit. If you learned something useful this week, hit subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating on iTunes or Spotify. Your support can help others discover What the AI. And finally, share your biggest AI questions and insights with us at email@whattheai.fm. We really do read every message and we do our best to cover them all on the show.